Friends, hello everyone. Lifesteal is on the air. Make yourselves comfortable because today in our studio, Dmitry Yakovin. Once again, Dmitry, welcome. He's here. He made it. By the way, I still have his passport, just so he doesn't run away. We all remember that? Dim, we've got an interesting topic today. There's doping in sports, right? We all know that very well. Kids inject themselves, take some pills. I've heard about it, really. I haven't seen it myself, but I have certainly heard quite a bit about it. Are there any truly effective supplements, completely legal and officially allowed, maybe something you can easily buy at a local pharmacy or a specialized sports nutrition store, that actually truly help to significantly boost athletic performance? During intense training, for faster recovery, the total amount of weight lifted, or the number of sets, are there specific supplements that really work effectively during your daily workouts?
If we take the most proven, the most well-studied ones available today, we're probably talking about more than thousands of extensive scientific studies conducted on many different sports, on athletes of different genders and across various different levels of training, that there are really only two specific substances you can actually name, and both of them happen to start with the letter C. That's creatine
and cocaine. We do not really recommend that.
No, caffeine. Creatine and caffeine, that's just, if you examine any scientific database, there is just an extraordinarily large number of studies with a wide variety of protocols related to both effectiveness and safety. So basically, all the questions about how it works and what you can get from it are fully covered.
Just recently, I happened to come across a Reels video where someone was being asked about the actual effectiveness of creatine. He said, well, it primarily retains water within the body, and that is exactly why it works for you. Like, you slightly increase your overall physical strength and your total body mass. This person, kind of considers himself to be a very knowledgeable and experienced specialist. But really, what does creatine do?
Creatine, yes. Carbohydrates actually retain water in our bodies to a much greater extent, and we don't eat 5 grams of them a day, but 500. Salt retains water too. And, well, probably that's not exactly the right mechanism he described. Moreover, I'll say this. It's actually not related at all to increased work capacity or performance. It is a well-known scientific fact that creatine can actually retain a significant amount of fluid within the human body. The primary biological mechanism is that by taking creatine as a daily supplement, we effectively increase the total amount of creatine present within our muscle tissues. Each of us naturally possesses a large quantity of creatine stored in the specific cells that consume the most metabolic energy. In fact, 95% of all the creatine in the human body is concentrated within muscle fibers and muscle cells, while the remaining 5% is found specifically in brain cells. The primary and most essential biological function of creatine within our muscles is to actively participate in the critical process of replenishing and restoring the overall levels of adenosine triphosphate. This is precisely how our cellular structures function during the complex process of energy expenditure that is directly related to intense muscle activity. The vital energy that is produced throughout our body in the form of ATP is eventually hydrolyzed into what we call adenosine diphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, is widely known as a vital molecule. As adenosine triphosphate releases essential energy to our biological cellular organelles for necessary muscle contraction, for facilitating the movement of oxygen within the sarcoplasm, and for the crucial activity of certain metabolic enzymes. Adenosine triphosphate is subsequently broken down into adenosine diphosphate. That is, a phosphate group is lost, and in order to successfully synthesize ATP again, we need to reattach a phosphate group directly back onto this adenosine diphosphate. This is where creatine comes in. It functions in a way very much like a dedicated porter or a taxi. It continuously circulates and moves within the cell and transfers the vital chemical energy that is generated in the mitochondria to the energy needed by all the various cellular organelles that are distant from the mitochondria. Mitochondria are the primary metabolic powerhouses of the cell, where 99% of all adenosine triphosphate is synthesized. Consequently, free creatine found in muscle cells efficiently captures and absorbs the phosphate that is formed during the consumption of ATP. In the mitochondria, it transfers it, for example, to the myofibrils, which are responsible for muscle contraction. And it restores this energy. The more creatine there is in the muscles, the more efficient this transport process becomes. The phosphate from the mitochondria to the myofibrils, and accordingly the speed of recovery of adenosine diphosphate to adenosine triphosphate. phosphates. So, by consistently consuming creatine supplements, we can effectively increase its natural reserves within our body by approximately 20 to 25%. It is important to note that overall, the human body is capable of producing creatine itself from the amino acids glycine and arginine. Essentially, our body produces this compound naturally from these two specific amino acids, glycine and arginine, to support our energy needs. And methionine also partially participates in this reaction. On average, about 1 gram, and a typical individual with an omnivorous diet, that is, someone who regularly consumes a variety of meat, dairy products, and fish, gets about 1 gram from food. So, in total, there are approximately 2 grams of creatine stored within the body of an average adult. When we take creatine as a supplement, and we take more than that amount, the amount of creatine that enters the muscles begins to increase. And it exceeds the amount of creatine that the muscles lose daily in the process of natural metabolism. Its reserves increase and reach their maximum levels. And precisely at this particular moment in time, when the internal reserves increase, a person begins to notice that during those specific types of activities that involve an exceptionally high level of physical energy expenditure, those that require a great degree of muscle intensity, such as lifting heavy weights or reaching maximum speed, their overall performance over a short period of time demonstrates a significant and measurable increase. For example, a person used to do 10 reps of the bench press with 100 kilograms. Then after loading up on creatine, they managed to do 12 reps. What is the primary advantage of this? The benefit is that the impact on the trained muscle group is significantly enhanced because 100 kilograms for 10 reps, that represents a specific level of mechanical tension and a distinct level of stress caused by physical exertion. If you start doing 100 kilograms for 12 reps, you're essentially setting a certain progression for yourself. To put it in a slightly different way, this workout, when compared to the previous one performed without creatine, will provide the vital physiological stimulus and necessary overload for further adaptation. So, by consistently loading up on creatine, its stores increase to the maximum level, and our training sessions become significantly more efficient and productive. The main types of sports where you can get results from creatine are, of course, speed and strength sports. These include powerlifting, bodybuilding, weightlifting, and sprinting. In other words, this includes all those sports where anaerobic load plays a decisive role in performance. This even applies to many team sports since they have a major anaerobic component. For example, in various team sports, a professional football player doesn't just stand still in one place watching the ball move. They are constantly engaging in high-intensity movements and bursts of energy.
There are some who do just that.
No, he periodically performs high-intensity sprints, which are essentially a uniform type of physical load. That is maximum acceleration, maximum intensity. When it comes to professional football players, creatine consistently proves to be remarkably effective. That is, they start running faster, intercepting the ball from the opponent more quickly, catching up with the opponent. Martial arts are always a mix of aerobic and anaerobic physical activities, since there is also an anaerobic component, and creatine is beneficial there as well. So in general, creatine doesn't actually work by increasing the total amount of fluid. That is actually just a secondary side effect, since creatine functions as an osmotically active component. In other words, for it to move through our body and be stored within our muscle cells, it requires a specific concentration. This must be maintained in direct relation to the surrounding fluid. Furthermore, it provides essential energy through its creatine phosphate metabolic pathway. This is the energy recovery pathway known as the creatine phosphate pathway.
Some people say, why do you even need creatine? Just eat meat.
In principle, yes, in 1 kilogram of meat, there is about 1 gram of creatine.
So do you have to eat a lot of kilograms of meat?
That is, by consuming a kilogram of meat, you'll receive about as much as stored in your muscles. And naturally speaking, there is.
And
if you wanted to increase to the maximum, well, you'd have to eat about 5 kilograms of meat every day. I think that's not very realistic.
Yeah, that's pretty unlikely.
That's how it is for us. The only way to increase the amount of creatine in your muscles to the maximum is by taking it as a supplement.
Either hydrochloride or monohydrate. Some people say, I took monohydrate and it messed me up. I had stomach issues. What's the difference between hydrochloride and monohydrate? Is it in the molecules or the structure or what?
No, in both cases, the active ingredient is pure free creatine. And these prefixes, apparently like monohydrate, these are just additional substances that are absolutely necessary for the proper absorption and transport of nutrients throughout the system. When we consider their specific effect on our body, particularly in terms of achieving optimal athletic results and physical performance, it doesn't really matter which form of creatine is used. But if we're talking about what's actually been studied and proven, then there's really no contest. 99.9% of all research has been done on creatine monohydrate. As for creatine hydrochloride, just try to find even a single study on it. Maybe you can discover 3 among 1,000 similar studies. At the same time, we have a remarkably small number of studies that, for example, directly compare them with each other. This includes the effectiveness of taking monohydrate, hydrochloride, creatine citrate, creatine malate, and various other available formulations. There are also esterified forms. Literally, one such study was published at the end of last year. It focused specifically on examining the degree of variations in athletic performance, occurring as a direct consequence of the loading phase and some kind of regular maintenance dose. So we load creatine and maintain its effectiveness. The findings of this comprehensive study clearly demonstrated that, regardless of the specific chemical form utilized, the final result was exactly equal to the total amount of pure creatine received. This occurs because the ratio of pure creatine to the specific component it is bound with, specifically in the form of these compounds with monohydrate or hydrochloride, will naturally vary significantly between the two. Well, give or take by about 10 to 15%. The amount of pure creatine a person receives will determine the final result. As for whether it was effective or not, I cannot say for certain, because again, no formal studies have been conducted on this specific subject. It remains currently unknown whether creatine monohydrate is truly tolerated less effectively than hydrochloride, or not. Why? This is because almost all research is focused on creatine monohydrate. That's why safety. Safety for the kidneys, safety for the liver, safety for the prostate, safety for hair growth, safety overall. From the perspective of changes in hormone levels in the body, it's all about monohydrate. No one needs hydrochloride, and citrate is rarely used either.
Are you taking it?
No, I'm not taking it.
From the common table,
Therefore, we are not afraid. And
creatine is great, that's clear. Caffeine is an effective supplement. Caffeine, you say it's effective and safe. But now people are going to attack you because they believe it's like cocaine, like a drug that you get hooked and it's all a disaster.
by the way, a certain dependence on caffeine can indeed occur. Most often, though, it's not from caffeine itself, but from coffee. More precisely, caffeine as part of the beverage. Because if a person who loves to drink coffee and feels some effect from it decides to give it up entirely and is offered a caffeine capsule instead, they'll say, I do not really need that, I want coffee. It's a significantly more complex and intricate effect on our reward system, which is directly responsible for the underlying development of.
How does caffeine work? Why does it makes you feel more awake?
To understand this better, we should note that it actually has 3 distinct and primary biological mechanisms that affect productivity. The first is related specifically to the state of alertness. Caffeine acts as a potent agonist of the A1 and A2 adenosine receptors. Adenosine is a naturally occurring chemical molecule that is produced within the brain cells, and by interacting with its receptors, it effectively suppresses wakefulness. So the function of adenosine is, for example, as the evening approaches, to shift us from a state of alertness to a much more relaxed state, so that we are more likely to transition into the sleep stage. Caffeine effectively binds to and blocks adenosine receptors, preventing adenosine from exerting its calming effects on the brain. So it turns out that even if your body naturally wants to relax you, and it can certainly do this during the day, like when you're just sitting, yawn, for example, then caffeine can help you artificially and pharmacologically to say, no, I don't want to sleep right now. I feel absolutely great. I'm completely full of strength and energy. And this specific effect takes place at the very deep level of the brain.
So it doesn't actually energize you, it just stops you from feeling tired.
Yes, it effectively prevents the body, so to speak, from undergoing its natural relaxation processes. It prevents calming processes from successfully overcoming stimulating ones. For example, if you're feeling bad, if you're in a particularly bad mood, caffeine alone might not be enough to get you out of that negative state. But if you truly get yourself ready for a workout, meaning you actively expect some positive changes, like now I'm going to exercise, I'm going to fight, or whatever else, you psych yourself up. And suddenly you notice that all those internal reasons telling you, no, don't do it, slow down, or just go later, they all just seem to disappear somewhere into the background. That's one of the mechanisms. In other words, it actively regulates and manages our performance at the level of the central nervous system. The second mechanism is that when caffeine penetrates into muscle cells, it facilitates and participates in the mobilization of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Just to make it clear, the calcium within our muscle cells effectively transmits biochemical signals related to the mechanical contraction of myofibrils. So when calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum enters the myofibrils, they start to contract. In other words, calcium transmits this signal. Caffeine significantly increases the total amount of calcium that enters the myofibrils, thereby enabling these fibers to contract much more intensely. This can demonstrate its effects either as a noticeable increase in working weights or as a substantially greater velocity of muscle contractions. And the third mechanism is not directly related to strength or speed, but rather to the overall duration of the physical load. Caffeine significantly enhances the rate of fat oxidation within muscle cells by suppressing glycogen breakdown, which is highly advantageous for athletes because it conserves glycogen stores. The more glycogen you have available, the longer you can continue to train at a very high intensity, because a decrease in glycogen leads to fatigue. You may still be able to do something, but you simply can't do it intensely, and you cannot perform at that elite level. To put it in another way, you can't perform the same amount of work effectively. Plus, the smaller amount of glycogen is used, the less lactic acid is produced in glycolytic muscle fibers. And lactic acid is one of those factors that essentially prevents you from continuing to work. So these are the three mechanisms. A change in the use of energy substrates, that is, more fat is oxidized, less carbohydrate, which means carbohydrates are conserved. Mobilization of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and inhibition. By the way, regarding fat oxidation, many people might think, oh, if more fat is used, then you'll lose a greater amount of weight. Well, by the way, here are the numbers. Caffeine, has been shown in numerous scientific studies to increase fat oxidation compared to the same exercise without caffeine. In several clinical studies, the dosage was 50 milligrams per minute, while in other studies, the recorded amount was 90 milligrams. In a minute. Well, if we take, let's say, a minimum of 50 milligrams per minute, that means 10 minutes plus 500 milligrams of fat. If you perform aerobic exercise for 1 full hour, your body will burn approximately 500 times 6.3 grams of additional fat. You will spend it. So you shouldn't think that these are some kind of major global changes, but in terms of energy savings, expenditure, and changes specifically in performance, this makes its own specific contribution. That is, creatine helps us restore ATP, while caffeine works in a completely different way and more comprehensively, both at the level of the central nervous system and directly at the level of muscle cells. And they can be utilized at the same time, since their pathways do not overlap with each other. However, there existed a scientific hypothesis that the effects of caffeine on muscles could potentially inhibit the effects of creatine, but that's just a hypothesis. In the end, it was never confirmed. There was also an opinion expressed that caffeine interferes with the absorption of creatine. They studied it, but there really isn't much of a significant difference. So in reality, the fact that both caffeine and creatine are present together in pre-workout formulas, I myself used to say about 10 years ago, yeah, that's a bad idea. Caffeine interferes with creatine. But actually, at this point, we can say with confidence, well, there's nothing significant that contradicts each other. They can be used simultaneously, both at the muscle level and in the gastrointestinal tract. They don't interfere with each other, and I think we can probably talk about the dosages too, maybe mention some of them. Someone from Germany wrote to me and said that in their gyms, everyone is on caffeine, taking 1 gram at a time before workouts. So they have finally reached the specific point where less than a gram, it just doesn't affect them.
Less than a gram for a natural athlete. This has always been known.
So once again, we have a vast amount of experimental data at our disposal. And basically, what can we say? Research suggests that 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight, taken approximately 45 to 60 minutes before a workout, is more than sufficient for a person to experience the full range of its physiological effects. However, continuing to increase the dosage beyond this point can significantly increasing the same work capacity may substantially enhance your overall mood, and it can effectively raise our internal perceived fatigue threshold. In other words, when you are mentally alert and feeling good, you are better equipped to manage the physical stress caused by intense exercise. That is precisely what we define as the threshold of perceived fatigue. You feel like, no, I can still keep going, I'm not tired yet. But the increase in dose is no longer directly proportional. So after 300 milligrams, consuming additional amounts of caffeine after that point has a diminishing and negligible impact on performance. So in scientific studies where researchers compare a dose of 3 milligrams to 6 milligrams, sometimes the 6 milligram dose yielded a greater result, but not twice as much. It was about 20 to 30% more.
When you get used to it,
You gradually become accustomed to it, and eventually you don't feel it anymore, right? Its effects are associated with feeling more alert and with an improved mood. But when it comes to muscle cells, it keeps working, yes, including in terms of changes in metabolic processes and energy substrates. This was studied in people who don't feel anything at all. They say, I'm totally fine, I can go to bed, have a drink, whatever, 2 capsules of coffee each with 200 milligrams, but the fat oxidation in their muscles still increased. So it turns out that at the level of the central nervous system, tolerance develops to the point of reduced effectiveness, but this doesn't happen at the muscle level. And now, about safety, many people are apprehensive of caffeine. They often criticize its effects. Indeed, no, caffeine shouldn't be consumed in uncontrolled amounts or quantities. Yes, we have official recommendations from global health authorities stating that about 400 milligrams per day is the maximum limit. This specific amount of caffeine is widely considered a safe level, and most healthy people without any cardiovascular diseases can easily tolerate it. However, professional athletes often have a much higher tolerance threshold for caffeine consumption. Professional athletes, in general, have a distinctly different metabolic processing of fats, proteins, carbohydrates, and certain substances that can cause deviations from normal functioning compared to the average person. So, athletes can actually consume larger amounts, completely avoiding the potentially harmful risk of developing cardiovascular side effects. At the very least, there's that same dose of 6 milligrams per kilogram. If an athlete weighs 100 kilograms, that's 600 milligrams. And we're talking about a single dose, not a daily dose. This is a one-time dose. In other words, its tolerability was simply excellent. So it's extremely rare for someone to take 6 milligrams per kilogram and develop tachycardia or any other side effects, even let's say from the gastrointestinal tract. Nevertheless, the more you increase the dosage from 3 milligrams per kilogram, the more often certain side effects occur. Probably the most serious side effect, well, not the most serious, but the most significant, is sleep disturbance. Why? Because if you have sleep disturbances, what's the point of boosting your performance in training with caffeine when, if you end up sleep deprived anyway, you'll just end up in a state of overtraining? It will still become harder for you to train because you're not getting enough sleep.
and it turns into a vicious circle, right?
Yeah.
You add more caffeine, then you do not sleep. Then more caffeine, and that is the cycle.
You made a good point. Caffeine really does help people cope with their, so to speak, regular day-to-day activities in situations when they have not had any sleep. This deliberate sleep deprivation that was used in the study was effectively and successfully compensated for by caffeine. People would stay up all night and then go to train, and caffeine helped them train just as if they had slept. But the only thing is, no one has conducted these studies over a long period of time, since it's simply not in line with medical ethics. It's dangerous for human health. Nevertheless, there are situations when a person hasn't slept at night, but it's not necessarily that they have to go train. We have various professional roles where a person is required to remain focused, concentrated, and alert at all times. The fact that they didn't sleep was simply out of necessity. They labored through the night. And as the sun rose, they had to persist in performing duties related to helping people. In this case, it would be justified. For example, a rescuer worked all night during a natural disaster, people are clearing debris, and there's no time to switch shifts. There simply are not enough personnel for individuals to replace one another. And exhausted rescuers might often work for 24 to 48 hours straight, clearing away heavy debris after a major earthquake. In situations like that, without caffeine, they simply wouldn't make it. So, in this case, it would actually be beneficial. But to avoid it interfering with falling asleep, you just need to consume it as far as possible from the time you plan to go to bed. On average, caffeine is fully metabolized in our bodies within 6 hours. That is, after 6 hours, its concentration is close to minimal.
So you need to top it up again.
Yes, but there are people whose caffeine metabolism is impaired, and for them, caffeine breaks down much more slowly. And it is precisely these groups of individuals who most frequently tend to experience unpleasant effects specifically associated with the cardiovascular system. Why is that? For them, one dose can overlap with the next. Because caffeine stays in the bloodstream for a long time, they have a cup of coffee here, another one there, then drink an energy drink, and it all accumulates. So instead of being eliminated from the body, it keeps building up and eventually reaches some critical levels. Or someone drinks it, I don't know, at 2 p.m., goes to bed and can't fall asleep. And why is that? Because for most people, after 6 hours, its concentration drops and it's gone, so it no longer affects the adenosine receptor. But for this person, even after 10 hours, caffeine is still blocking the adenosine receptor. Well, there aren't that many people like this, but they do exist.
What else would you recommend? Caffeine, creatine, we've kind of heard about them, read something somewhere. Are there any other secrets, interesting supplements worth paying attention to when you're training?
Yes, I can certainly name a few examples, but I should say right away that the level of evidence for them is significantly lower than for the same ones. Caffeine and creatine. For example, beta-alanine. It is frequently included in pre-workout formulas, but the reality is that for the many people who drink these pre-workout mixes, beta-alanine is largely ineffective. Why? Beta-alanine is particularly effective for those specific types of physical activities that last continuously for a duration of 1 to 4 minutes. I mean, not the whole training session, but you take a specific exercise and you can successfully perform that specific movement. From 1 to 4 minutes until failure. In bodybuilding, there simply aren't any exercises like that. In bodybuilding, the intensity level is such that exercises usually end after a brief window of 15 to 45 seconds. That's it. The set is completely finished at that point. But that's already significantly closer, I would even say, to the realm of aerobic exercise.
CrossFitters?
CrossFit, yes, that's quite possible. Or martial artists, where they have a mixed mode. For example, those guys who do wrestling, for instance. How does beta-alanine work?
Yes, briefly, how does it work?
As briefly as possible, yes. Beta-alanine, once it enters the body, combines with the amino acid histidine, and from this combination, so-called carnosine is formed. And carnosine acts as a buffer in muscle cells. What does buffer mean? It regulates the acid-base balance. It eliminates, or more precisely neutralizes, those substances that increase acidity. During physical exertion, lactic acid accumulates in our bodies, hydrogen ions appear, meaning the acid-base balance in the working muscles shifts toward acidity. This physiological condition is called acidosis. And acidosis itself can contribute significantly to local muscle fatigue, which will prevent you from being able to continue the exercise. Acidosis is a highly influential and critical factor that limits our overall performance, especially when the exertion lasts for a while, from 1 to 4 minutes. For example, when I was doing Russian or folk bench press, and let's say I competed in the Russian bench press with a 75 kilogram nomination, that is, you press a 75 kilogram barbell for as many reps as you can, it turned out that the set lasted more than a minute because I could press 75 kilograms about 85 times. That is roughly 1 minute and 30 seconds, or even 1 minute and 40 seconds. At this point, the process of muscle acidification becomes a major factor. You stop doing the exercise. You keep pressing forward, pressing, and at first it feels quite easy, like at rep 79, then 80.
Done.
Nothing at all. It happens instantly. You can't even feel it. The weight is light, but your muscles just refuse to work. After that, you can even lie down and try to do a push-up, but it's impossible to push up. That's a condition known as acidosis. So, the more carnosine there is in your muscles, the more effectively your muscles will manage and regulate the accumulation of those substances, to remove, more precisely, those substances that are associated with shifting the acid-base balance towards acidity. And
the stage of failure lasts longer.
Yes, it's like you're pushing it back. The moment you reach
failure. In the moment, for example, the cumulative effect works. Or, for example, if you have some kind of movement coming up, you can take it and you'll feel the effect.
Yes, that's a good question. It's specifically a cumulative effect. So if you take it just once, 2 grams of beta-alanine, the most you'll feel is the effect of paresthesia.
Paresthesia?
Your face or your palms will start to itch.
Ears don't matter at all.
But for it to actually reach the muscles, that is, you see, this beta-alanine has to combine with histidine, and then all of it gets distributed throughout all your muscles, including the heart muscle. So only a tiny fraction of a percent will reach each muscle cell. In other words, nothing much will change inside a specific muscle. The intake protocol here is very similar. It's similar to taking creatine. It also works in such a way that you need to keep taking it until it accumulates. On average, you need to take between 2 and 6 grams per day for a period of 10 to 15 days to reach the maximum level.
Concentration. For example, if we're talking about the Russian folk bench press, if I start loading up on beta-alanine 2 weeks early, I might be able to slightly increase my performance by 2 or 3 extra reps, 2 or 3.
2 weeks will most likely be enough to reach the maximum concentration level. By the way, regarding the tingling paresthesia sensation it has, by itself it isn't directly related to enhanced athletic performance, but in studies, this effect often, how should I best describe this phenomenon, was accompanied by significantly improved training performance. Now, why exactly does that happen? Because of the placebo effect. When a person begins to physically experience the actual effects of a substance, even if it is just a simple itching sensation, they start to believe that the substance has truly started to work. So, even from a marketing perspective, selling supplements or pre-workout complexes containing beta-alanine is a good idea. Of course, there are people who really don't like this effect, but personally, for example, I'm the opposite. When I take it, the first thing I feel is my head starts to itch, and I immediately get this association. That's it, the substances are in my bloodstream. Now I'm going to have a great workout, so it's kind of indirect. In other words, you feel the effect. It's like, even the taste of a drink, it can influence your perception. For example, the taste of an energy drink, if it's sweet and relaxing, or if it has a bit of sourness, bitterness, or spiciness, it can be invigorating. Again, through what? Through its effect on the brain, through certain associations. To avoid paresthesia, if it bothers someone, you should take less than 2 grams at a time. And this particular effect, I should add, does not always manifest the same way. So at some point, you might take 2 grams of beta-alanine and you'll feel a tingling, itchy sensation all over. A week later, it just itches a little bit. Then somehow people think the supplement stopped working. In reality, it's just that the side effects have lessened. Its effect isn't related to the tingling, but to accumulation, but people still don't like it. Many consumers often think that if the product itches less, it might mean that the formula is being absorbed less or there is less of the active ingredient in the overall product. They start to get anxious. This is already a nocebo effect showing up. When yes, everything is fine, everything is working, but because you don't feel the side effect, you start to convince yourself that you won't get a good result since there's no tingling in your face.
Actually, if you start itching, you should see a dermatologist, venereologist.
Depends where. Yes.
If a specific spot starts to itch somewhere.
If the paresthesia has moved to the lower part of the body, then it's probably not paresthesia. What else can we talk about? Well, for example, about citrulline malate.
Yeah, citrulline malate, I actually like it even more than arginine.
There's an interesting point here related to how it works. Well, a lot of people see it as a pump supplement. Citrulline means a pump supplement, right? It dilates blood vessels. Why is that? Because citrulline turns into arginine, and arginine is a substrate for nitric oxide synthesis, well, in our blood vessel endothelium. But interestingly, numerous scientific studies confirm that citrulline malate exerts a significant effect related to the increased production of nitric oxide and subsequent vasodilation. Vasodilation is precisely the relaxation of blood vessel walls, as a result of which they widen. However, this effect is observed only at rest and during aerobic exercise. During strength training, the oral supplementation of citrulline malate in any dosage did not result in an increase of vasodilation. But why exactly does this happen? Because the natural physiological effect that typically occurs in any person not using any additional supplements, which is directly related to the widening of blood vessels during intense physical activity, already reaches its maximum possible physiological level. For example, when you eat foods rich in carbohydrates, if your muscles are low on glycogen, what do you notice right away? You see increased vascularity, for example, in your arms and legs. This is called insulin-dependent vasodilation. Insulin, by identifying and detecting where there are cells that can more easily take up glucose, starts to widen the blood vessels in those specific areas, carefully regulating and managing the secretion of nitric oxide, specifically in the vessels supplying muscles that are currently low on glucose. And that is exactly why our blood vessels undergo a process of local expansion in the muscles, so that more essential nutrients can efficiently and reliably get there. During physical activity, we also experience vasodilation, but in this case, it's not due to insulin, but rather to adrenaline and noradrenaline. These are counter-regulatory hormones. The primary function of these processes is to increase the flow of energy from internal resources to the working muscles, enhance fat oxidation, accelerate glycogen breakdown, and increase the transport of glucose from the liver and the bloodstream into the working muscles. And that's why adrenaline and noradrenaline also affect the degree of vasodilation, the widening of blood vessels, so that the working muscles, the ones you're training during your workout, grow, receive more nutrients, and remove the byproducts of energy metabolism. So this physiological effect by itself is already reaching its maximum from the standpoint of our physiology, such that taking additional citrulline does not enhance it further. To put it in another way, it activates the maximum potential that our body is capable of. I mean, this is the natural effect that every human being possesses. But people say, I feel citrulline, And that's why adrenaline and noradrenaline also affect the degree of vasodilation, the widening of blood vessels, so that the working muscles, the ones you're training during your workout, can grow, receive more nutrients, and remove the byproducts of energy metabolism. So this physiological effect by itself is already at the absolute maximum possible level from the standpoint of our physiology. So taking additional citrulline will not further increase it at all. In other words, it produces, well, the maximum that our body is capable of. I mean, this inherent natural phenomenon that every single individual possesses. But people say, I feel citrulline, I don't feel citrulline, specifically in terms of the pump. Or, for instance, yesterday I felt it, but today I don't. This happens precisely because, in reality, citrulline doesn't produce any truly significant or measurable effect on the pump during strength training. And since the pump is dependent on many other physiological factors, well, the pump, in quotes, as we're talking here, including the expansion and development of the vascular network. It depends, for example, on nutritional status, the amount of glycogen in the muscles, and the specific training protocol. Because these factors can change from workout to workout, our perception of whether there is a pump or not can also change.
So am I taking citrulline for nothing then?
Well, you're consuming this supplement, not for nothing, you just will not be able to experience the extra vasodilation effect. And its effect, specifically related to increased athletic performance, is due to the fact that citrulline is converted directly into arginine. And arginine is then used to effectively eliminate ammonia from the blood. Where does ammonia in the blood come from during workouts? Whenever these muscle proteins begin to break down, or when proteins are damaged, especially if your workout is very intense, whether it is aerobic or anaerobic, this workout will in any case lead to the breakdown of muscle proteins, including both the sarcoplasmic and the fibrillar types. When these proteins break down, nitrogen is released into the system, which then gets converted into ammonia. Ammonia present in the blood is a highly toxic substance. Your complex brain naturally perceives ammonia as a detrimental fatigue-inducing toxin, meaning that when it detects a sharp increase in blood ammonia levels, the brain starts to make you significantly decrease your overall physical performance to prevent this condition from worsening. You experience this as a strong psychological reluctance to continue your workout, and you perceive it as a heavy wave of fatigue coming over you. You notice that you no longer want to keep training, you feel tired, and you want to stop. So this ammonia, since it is highly toxic and harmful for brain cells and others, is naturally neutralized by the liver, which converts it into urea, a process called ureogenesis, and then the kidneys finally excrete it. Arginine effectively helps the liver process ammonia much more quickly. After you finish a set, your ammonia levels rise and you start feeling worse. That is exactly when citrulline or arginine comes to the rescue. But why do I mention citrulline and not arginine? It turns out that for most people, taking citrulline is significantly more efficient and effective than taking arginine itself, because arginine is first metabolized and broken down in the intestinal cells, specifically by the enzyme arginase, and then it is further broken down within the liver's metabolic pathways. So first arginine reaches the intestines, and then through the portal vein it finally gets to the liver. As a result, there might be nothing left of it. That is precisely why numerous scientific research studies show that citrulline, which is directly converted into arginine within our body, successfully bypasses all of these physiological barriers. Citrulline is not significantly broken down or degraded by any enzymes in our intestines, nor in the liver, and once it finally enters the bloodstream, it steadily and confidently turns into arginine. So, does that mean citrulline can increase arginine levels more effectively and efficiently than arginine itself? And in this way, As a result of this effect, ammonia levels decrease and you will simply start to feel much better. And as a result, you can perform a greater volume of work. And what is truly interesting to explore is how exactly does citrulline work? In various scientific studies, it does not directly stimulate the nervous system and it does not make you perform more reps in a single set. Instead, it effectively prevents a gradual decrease in your physical performance from one set to the next. For example, you did a bench press. In the first set, you might do 10 reps, then 9 again, followed by 8 and 7. However, if you take citrulline, you could perform 10, then 9, and 9. This means that the natural decrease in your physical performance from set to set, specifically thanks to using citrulline, will become significantly less pronounced over time. In other words, you'll be able to accomplish significantly more effective work. And this positive effect develops almost immediately. That is, no downloads or anything else is needed. In fact, it is quite easy to increase the level of arginine in the blood by taking it orally. Citrulline molate.
If you incorporate a combination of caffeine, creatine, and beta-alanine, then your workout can be natural without any banned doping and much more effective.
Quite good. That's why he tries to take everything into account when creating training complexes. But there's something else I'd like to point out. We also have some other substances. They are rarely encountered. For example, nitrates. Nitrates that are present in dietary supplements in the form of beet extract. Beets contain a lot of nitrates. When nitrates enter our body, they are converted into nitrites. And from nitrites, nitric oxide is synthesized. The mechanism of effect is the same there. Arginine is used for the synthesis of nitric oxide, with the help of the enzyme endothelial synthase in the endothelium. And nitrite can also be used for the synthesis of nitric oxide, just through different pathways. But the result is the same, but they are just quite rare, so we don't talk about them. So, out of all these supplements, you need to understand that each of them works through different mechanisms. And your training protocol may align to a greater or lesser extent with the specific dietary supplements you take. For example, if you're a powerlifter, you do 3 to 5 reps per set and then rest for 10 minutes. But beta-alanine won't do anything for you. You don't experience any acid buildup at all. So with your protocol, all you feel is an itchy face. You take it, but it doesn't give you any effect. Citrulline malate, same thing. It's not really relevant for powerlifting. Why? In powerlifting, it's common to rest a lot. But if you take a short break for a full 10-minute period, your elevated blood ammonia, it will go away on its own during that time. You don't need to wait 10 minutes. In 2 or 3 minutes, the ammonia will be completely neutralized. And citrulline just helps make this process faster. When you rest for a limited amount of time, it increases the efficiency of restoring your blood composition back to normal. And a pre-workout complex tries to provide a kind of universal effect. It will definitely help someone. But it's not guaranteed that all these substances will be effective for your specific needs, because this one might help, and this one might not, since you train in your own unique way. Creatine before a workout most likely won't do anything because its effect is cumulative, right? Beta-alanine most likely also has a cumulative effect, except for that placebo effect in the form of tingling, right? Citrulline gives a one-time effect, caffeine gives a one-time effect. So we end up saying, oh, there's a lot of interesting stuff here. But really, if you remove creatine and beta-alanine, which have cumulative effects, basically nothing changes. And there are some interesting studies that compared commercially available pre-workout complexes from different manufacturers, those with 5, 6, or 7 components, sometimes with added vitamins, and compared them separately to caffeine. And what's interesting is that the results were often not much different from each other. In fact, caffeine helps most people because it positively influences both aerobic and anaerobic performance, as well as mood, concentration, and the perception of fatigue. And that's why
Just buy the simplest caffeine, sodium benzoate.
you can do that.
The cheapest one at the pharmacy, no fancy additives. I remember we used to take those, the ones in a paper blister pack. 6 tablets containing caffeine and sodium benzoate.
Yeah, I think it is now prescription only.
Prescription only, really?
Occurred years ago.
We used to really go hard on those without any of those pre-workout mixes back in those days. And honestly, it worked great, by the way.
So when I, for example, analyze various pre-workouts, I always make sure to check if there's caffeine. Well, at least you'll definitely feel a noticeable effect.
Yeah.
By the way, there was a very interesting and comprehensive meta-analysis conducted on the specific effects of legal ergogenic supplements on professional athletes involved in combat sports. They looked at various different types, kickboxing, judo, and grappling. But in any case, this included all types of competitive combat sports, that generally a mix of aerobic and anaerobic activity. So the matches are long, but they are periodically accompanied by bursts of activity or efforts that require maximum strength. So, when looking at all types of supplements together, how do they affect various performance indicators? Physical attributes like running speed, muscular strength, cardiovascular endurance, and vertical jump height, there are a lot of different performance tests. However, the overall effect that most often led to positive results in these tests was from caffeine. They conducted a detailed comparison of beta-alanine, creatine, and citrulline malate. Each of these substances had its own unique and beneficial effects on performance. But in terms of the overall number of effects and, let's say, the actual frequency of these effects, the results varied. This is because creatine sometimes produced results and other times simply didn't. For example, while beta-alanine was suitable for a judoka and for a kickboxer as well, it was not as effective for a boxer. But caffeine most often was suitable for all of them. This one, that one, and the other. It's universal, yes. I'm not exactly praising caffeine, it's just, well, I'm stating the objective facts and quoting the scientific research. So, if you want to sell some kind of pre-workout supplement, just pack it with as many ingredients as possible to make it look impressive, so you can write a whole book about it, but don't forget to add the caffeine. But our Rospotrebnadzor agency still regulates the total amount of caffeine. At least those cans you see in stores, the 450 milliliter or standard half-liter size ones, they contain about 100 up to 130, or maybe even 140 milligrams of caffeine. I think for larger individuals now, that specific amount of caffeine is highly improbable to have any meaningful physiological impact.
For gym goers and athletes, they must add a little extra.
Yes, I'll probably have to drink a liter. Or drink a can and a capsule of caffeine, 150 milligrams.
Or maybe espresso.
Look, yes. By the way, I did the same thing, took a double espresso. I actually once took 2 double espressos and mixed them in one glass, which is about 400 milligrams of caffeine. Disgusting. It tasted bad.
Really bad.
But I really felt it. Yeah, I just suddenly became so cheerful right away. I'm driving along the road, waving to everyone.
Hi.
Letting them through. Who cut me? I said, it's all good, no worries.
Yeah. Friends, it turns out that caffeine is probably the most effective remedy.
Among those that work instantly.
Yes, it works right away. One of the most effective ways to achieve results and boost the effectiveness of your workouts. Together with Dimitri, we also engaged in a detailed discussion about other highly effective supplements that you can depend upon for your progress, that you can pay close attention to when carefully constructing, so to speak, your own personal supplement regimen for your training. As always, Dimitri explained everything in detail. As always, everything was laid out clearly. Write in the comments what other topics you'd like us to cover. Which of the supplements mentioned above are you already taking? Do you feel the effects of caffeine? How do you prefer to take your coffee? Do you take it as espresso, as a cappuccino, or perhaps just as caffeine capsules? My dear friends, thank you so much for watching. Let's thank Dima, of course, for coming today and sharing all of this information with us. We will post all the useful links in the description and in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give us a like. Friends, this was Living Steel. Goodbye for now.